Understand me because sometimes it's a little bit hard to get everything through, but thank you so much. And I'm very honored and proud, of course, that is the start of the lecture, of the Van Eesteren lecture. And I just want to give you some few words about the EFL Foundation. The EFL Foundation stands for Van Eesteren, Vluk, Van Lohuizen. And it's founded in 1975, and it has a dual purpose. On one hand, it's the preservation of the intellectual legacy of its name givers, Van Eesteren, Van Lohuizen. And for who of you they don't know them, Van Eesteren and Van Lohuizen were very important and very famous in the Dutch planning tradition, urban and regional planning tradition. And for example, they are well known about their expansion plan of the city of Amsterdam in 1934. And the unique thing of their work is the combination of research, design, policy, and politics. So that makes it very special and very today very important as well. So on one hand, we preserve the legacy, but on the other hand, we try to stimulate people to apply for subsidy. We can give them money for research, to do some research, and especially to connect new coming themes for the urban and regional planning and design to the fields of design, planning, policy, and politics. And that's very nice and unique. And one of our projects is to fund the Van Eesteren Chair. So we are very proud that Caroline is now the fellowship holder. And especially because Caroline addresses for us, she added some new things in the Dutch planning tradition. So more the focus also on social issues, justice issues, and that makes it enriches the Dutch planning tradition, we hope and we expect it. And that for us is very important because nowadays, besides of climate change and all the huge issues that are going on, there are especially also some very specific social issues that we have to address. So therefore, I'm very proud that she had the inspiration to organize these lectures, and today it's the first. And so I'm also very curious and also proud that Barbara Lipietz is the one who is giving the first lecture, and I'm very curious what she's going to tell us and she's going to bring us. And I hope it will give us some thoughts to work on in our fields. So thank you so much, and I give the word back to Caroline.
Okay, thank you very much, Hilde. And so without further ado, I introduce Dr. Barbara Lipietz, who is an associate professor at the DPU, the Development Planning Unit at the Faculty of the Built Environment at UCL. She's also the director of the MSc in Urban Development Planning and convenes the research cluster on urban transformations. She is an interdisciplinary planner with a research focus on the political and institutional dynamics of urban development planning, and has an interest in understanding the role of different urban actors in reaching social and spatial justice. So Barbara, the floor is yours.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you so much, Caroline and Hilde, for your very warm introduction. And it's such a pleasure and an honor for me also to be part of this series of conversation, to participate in this really exciting series of conversation that Caroline is curating around grounded, just, and I'm going to try and pronounce it, unapologetically ethical planning practice. I have to commend you, Caroline, on this title. And the ambition for this series. It's a difficult word to pronounce, but it is a wonderful lens to be rethinking and redoing planning. So I'm very happy to be part of this conversation, and I really hope it will be a conversation to be part of a reflection and to engage with people around this virtual table. So I was asked by Caroline to set the scene a little bit, to some degree, to focus on the contribution of the NUA, the New Urban Agenda, to this debate, to this idea of unapologetically just ethical planning. And of course, it makes sense because it is purportedly the latest and most ambitious global revisiting of collective intervention in urban areas. And it also is really relevant because, interestingly, it puts planning squarely back on the agenda in this ambition towards sustainable and just societies. And I'm going to quote the just, safe, healthy, accessible, affordable, resilient, and sustainable cities for all inhabitants of present and future generations without discrimination of any kind. I give the sentence because it's the flowery language of the UN documents, and it might also give a hint of some of the issues that are behind it because it tries to put so much into the NUA. So I'm going to, of course, oblige Caroline and discuss a little bit about what this NUA entails and what kind of planning it promotes and how far it effectively sets up the means to reach its ambition. So my sense, and of course, I'll be very happy to hear your different or similar opinions. My sense is that it promises a lot. It does bring certainly a lot of very interesting issues on the table, or it did bring a lot of very interesting issues on the table, but it fails to convince me sufficiently because, one, it's mired in contradictions, which to some degree is the inevitable result of being a compromise document developed at the UN level. And what it means is it doesn't give clear guidelines or a line in the sand, if you want. And I'm going to use this expression, a line in the sand, a few times to deal with these contradictions. And secondly, I think with others in the planning field that it conveys in a way a bit of a somewhat dated or outdated, may I say so, conception of planning and the planner in the state, which is able to steer change unequivocally. So the kinds of tools that it proposes tend to be quite, I mean, there's a vast array of them, but they are possibly placed in an imagination of the urban and planning that is actually very locally specific and that might not talk so globally. So what I will then do is to sort of suggest also that the SDGs have ultimately seem to have superseded the NUA as this normative global frame for planning for a sustainable and equitable world. Again, I'm very happy to hear what are your views on that, whether you think that that is correct. But again, for me, fails a little bit with steering, with giving a clear steer on unapologetically just planning. And finally, what I'd like to do is maybe bring attention to this current moment, the moment that we live in, this COVID-19 times, and the challenge to planning for just and sustainable cities that it represents, and the ways in which arguably it is potentially providing us with a clear sense of where that red line or that line in the sand should be, and where the actors of that planning, or who the actors of that planning for more just, and one could add maybe at this stage more caring cities lie. So this is what I'd like to talk, and of course, Caroline, do interrupt me if I'm taking too long, and if we want to take, for instance, this COVID story more into the debate that comes later on. I think there's some really promising issues here. But let's go back to the NUA then. The NUA, if you remember, the New Urban Agenda, so it was in October 2016 in Quito, and it was was meant to be signed off in this big urban event, Habitat 3. And if you remember, there was something very specific about the New Urban Agenda in October 2016. It was that it was the last cog actually in an evolving and consolidating global framework for our common future, which had been steered under the aegis of various members of the UN family. So you had, for instance, and very importantly, the Agreement on Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, in September 2015, that had really set the tone with the ambition of transforming our world and leaving no person and no place behind. I think it's an important conception for us as planners to think of no place behind also. And that set, importantly, global targets, not just for the developing world, or the global south, and adding critical dimensions of climate action, goal 13, inequality, addressing inequalities, goal 10, and sustainable urbanization, so this urban goal, goal 11. There was, of course, the Conference of Parties COP21, which brought the Paris Agreement, sought to develop this climate accord on climate change. There was, of course, a little bit earlier in 2015, the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction. So again, a focus on building resilient futures to meet this agenda for sustainable development. The World Humanitarian Summit in May 2016, which sought to, again, bring in humanitarian needs in line with commitments of the SDGs. And then there was also a big finance for development conference in July 2015. So the NEA came at the end of all of this, and it's important to note because it was really meant to sort of bring all of this thinking together and also enshrine these new global development and climate agendas, and also enshrine these sort of implementation pledges. So what was also interesting about the NUA is that it was meant to emphasize the positive role that urbanization could play in bringing about these development goals, these sustainable development objectives. And again, that was sort of slightly new in these big international fora, where often this the trend towards urban bias had been present. So what it did was to bring forward this message that urbanization, well-planned urbanization, let me put it that way, well-planned urbanization would be a way of addressing many of the sustainable objectives and equality objectives that were set at the global scale. And certainly, it is worthwhile to mention some of the really interesting articulation of just principles and some of the interesting tools that were put forward in the NUA. So I'm going to list here a few. Certainly it references throughout the text strong progressive concepts which are enshrined in the rights-based principles of the United Nations Charter. So for instance, the commitment to sustainable development, climate change mitigation, risk reduction through people-centered and integrated approaches to urbanization. It also integrated, interestingly, questions around food and nutrition into planning through a systems and urban metabolism perspective. It had a call for productivity, but along with the recognition and support for the informal sector and the social and solidarity economy. It did mention forced eviction only once, but certainly it recognized the social value of land, and did talk about the prevention of land speculation. It does feature in the document. And also, interestingly, it put an emphasis on local tax system, which was again an innovation of the NUA, and buttressed and local finance, and put forward the notion of local finance with, for instance, value capture mechanism, which are revalorized in the NUA. Again, a number of recognition of the human settlements across urban-rural continuum, etc. It also references participatory governance on a number of moments, and which these are often ensconced in notions of belonging, recognition, empowerment, especially of more vulnerable groups. Interestingly, of course, it mentions also the right to the city for the first time in the new urban agenda. But that right to the city is, in the final version, was quite truncated, in particular with removing notions of the city as a common good, which had featured in the how would you call it? Is it the penultimate version of the NUA before the last version was enshrined? And so this, in a way, is a lead to the contradictions that I'd like to raise around the NUA. So promises a lot of interesting issues on the table, but fails to convince, because it is, and I'm not alone, find that it is mired in contradictions. no doubt because of the result of compromise between a variety of signatory states and lobbies at the heart of the NUA. For instance, the watering down of the right to the city in the last version of the New Urban Agenda was extremely hardly fought and was the result of basically resistance from a number of signatory states. At the same time, also a watering down of Habitat 1, and we're talking 40 years before, which had made a commitment to the right to adequate housing, here is recognized only as moving towards a full and progressive right to adequate housing. So for many civil society actors who'd been fighting for this was a real disappointment. But also tensions between visions and implementing proposals. So for instance, the recognition of the social value of land, which I've just mentioned, which was which was a progressive and relatively new dimension here, or was reasserted, sat very uncomfortably, or sits very uncomfortably with the call for competitive cities and for housing and public spaces to act as drivers of economic growth. Or indeed the very limited challenge to the notion of financialization of land and housing markets that is also present in the NUA. What many have identified, therefore, those who were campaigning for a more progressive vision of the NUA, and here I sit having worked with a number of organizations that were lobbying, that were trying to shape various of the fora to discuss the content of the NUA. What was really lacking was a clear guidance as to how these inevitable contradictions, if you want, that are thrown up by complex development processes where there's always going to be trade-offs. There isn't a clear line in the sand in the NUA to sort of say, right, we know that there's these multiple objectives here, but ultimately this is what needs to trump, right? And a number of those groups, for instance, had tried to advocate for prioritization and protection of rights and entitlements of human settlements' most vulnerable citizens, for instance, and also along with a reinforcing of the distributive dimension of sustainable development. Others also who worked not with civil society groups, but had worked more with, for instance, either through academic lobbying, or indeed through the UN's own UN Habitat's own 2016 World Cities report, had, for instance, developed a cities chapter that had forefronted the notion of just sustainabilities, for instance. So the feeling is that the NUA in its final incantation was basically lacking in this overall ultimate guidance and had let go of some of these more fundamental restructuring proposal. Another complaint or sort of dissatisfaction with the NUA's proposal, which has been developed by a number of colleagues in the planning field specifically. I'm thinking here of Vanessa Watson and Sue Parnell, and I would tend to agree very much with them, is that the NUA in many ways, because, well, the NUA was very nice in the way that it put forward the potential role of planning as an actor of change, of progressive change. It did so nonetheless in a way that seemed to borrow a lot from forms of planning, I'm going to be quite direct, that were developed in Spain, let's say, in the late 1990s. And this is probably a reference to John Close, who was leading the NUA at the time, and who brought a lot of the very interesting and fascinating experience of the Barcelona model of strategic planning, and who actually infused a lot of that reflection within the NUA. So a lot of a sense of planning being done by the state in a bounded fashion, and able to steer change in quite an unequivocal fashion. And again, this idea of the urban having quite strong boundaries and spatial planning, being able to steer planning within space as a container. And of course, a lot of the critique of planning by academics, but of course by practitioners and by social movements and others, is that actually urban development takes place in a different fashion. Urban development is very much a relational process, whether you're thinking of space, whether you're thinking about economic activities, whether you're thinking about networks of solidarity within cities. And that actually this mode of thinking of planning was not responding to these various possibilities for understanding the city and therefore acting in the city. So this is what I'd like to say about the NUA. And maybe just a very quick point here to say that in the event, I find interesting, and again, I'm really happy to hear your point of view on that. I find quite interesting that the NUA, the New Urban Agenda, seems to have lost a little bit of its impetus as this steering, as rather this rallying cry for moving with planning, for rethinking planning, for acting around planning. Even though I have to emphasize also what was very interesting in the process was that as all these big events, you know, which only happened every 20 years, to be honest, but it did develop an extraordinary engagement and reactivation of urban thinking amongst a whole array of actors. So not only planners and professionals, not only in academia, but of course also in the realm of local community organizations, and also of course the role of local authorities within that process was quite complicated, because the NUA, even though it has to be implemented at the local scale, is something that is debated by national level governments. So the NUA, or the Habitat 3 conference, with the development of the NUA agenda, the New Urban Agenda, did catalyze a whole series of really interesting discussions and platforms of engagement that survive to these days, and that remain very interesting fora for thinking about and doing just urban planning, if you want. And I'm thinking, for instance, the Global Platform for the Right to the City, which brought together, which came together to try and have the Global Platform for the Right to the City inserted in the NUA. And which brought together UCLG, so United Cities and Local Government, along with academic institutions, but also a whole array of community-led networks and organizations, such as the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, the SDI Shack Dwellers International, but also more radical groups such as AI, and I'm going to have something of International Inhabitants, Alliance of Inhabitants, International Alliance of Inhabitants. So really interesting processes. Now, the mobilization for thinking and acting around the urban objectives seems to have moved with the SDGs. And because of time, I see that it's almost half an hour past already. Do I still have a bit of time, Caroline? Oh, okay. In that case, let me.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Thank you. So what is interesting though is, as more of this attention in the process of thinking about localizing these big frameworks, these big global frameworks, it seems to me that the shift has gone to the SDGs, possibly because of some issues within UN Habitat, but I think possibly also because of the focus, the huge amount of attention within the SDGs around showing implementation, developing a whole series of indicators to show that there is progress. And the discussion around urban development and urban planning to some degree has inserted itself within this global conversation around how does one evidence progress, how does one do that. Saying that, and I'm not going to spend too much time on the SDGs now, so we can come back later, my sense, again, and in discussion with colleagues within the current big research project that I'm working on, which is the Knowledge in Action for Urban Equality, or KNOW project, we're currently working with some colleagues here on precisely looking at the SDGs, and can the SDG 11 and SDG 10 in particular, which is around which is around inequality, can these be appropriated in a way that is more, that actually is of use to community-led approaches to planning. And the reason I'm talking about this question of appropriation is that actually within the SDGs, you have the same issues as you have within the NUA, which is the New Urban Agenda, which is, in a sense, a very broad framework that can speak to many different people, where there are potential for contradictions. And the question again is, does the SDGs, SDG 11, SDG 10, does it provide enough of a strong line in the sand, which I keep going back as a way of maybe thinking about a way towards a clear direction towards this unapologetically just planning that we're looking for. So the work that we're currently doing is about trying to, is about realizing that it is not obvious. It is already being, that these contradictory targets are already potentially being used for not necessarily very progressive responses, but that there is a space to capture some of the language within the SDGs that one can connect also to the NUA in order to push for different processes. But that requires, again, taking a more ethical engagement with the complex array of objectives within the SDGs. And also it implies taking a perspective of those, of precisely those who should not be left behind and the places who should not be left behind. And that's why I would like to, but there is an urgency that needs to be connected to that in order for that to be actualized, because the SDGs in themselves or the NUA in themselves won't provide that. And that's why I think the current moment and discussions around COVID-19 are, in the midst of the horribleness that is surrounding all of us, are potentially a moment for reasserting some of these principles. As you will all know, wherever you are located and wherever you have been, COVID-19 will have shed light on inequalities in ways in which those who were interested in these issues were very much aware, but could be forgotten in many societies, because, you know, the inertia, the status quo has such a strong power that actually one could forget about it. Or because in many parts of the world, the invisibilization of whole chunks of societies, of urban societies, has been a norm for a very long time. And what COVID-19 has done is to show that this is no longer really possible, that there is, first of all, an interdependence between every members of societies in urban societies, and actually, of course, beyond the boundaries of the urban. I'm focusing here on urban because this is the topic of our conversation. But it has focused on these interdependencies and has really shown the depth of the structural inequalities that pervade all of our societies, in different ways, of course, in different ways through various axes of class, gender, age, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, etc., etc. So COVID-19 has shown that to the fore in quite an extraordinary way. COVID-19 has also shown that precisely in those neighborhoods, we can call them precarious neighborhoods, where the state has not been so able to penetrate, or has not been able to, or in the context of this pandemic and the emergency, these neighborhoods have managed to survive because of networks of care and solidarity. And and they've managed to respond in an immediate fashion, and sometimes, in the best of times, being able to locate, to use these networks of care that were pre-existent and locate emergency responses within an advocacy for longer term processes of change. What COVID-19 has done is that it has, if one cares to look, but there is now much more lenses that are looking at that, is showing the real, how would I say, the planning agencies of many of these, of organized collectives on their own, but often in synergy with others across cities, with other actors in the cities. What's been really interesting is that in many parts of the world, cities haven't fully collapsed because of these systems, and local governments, many local governments have woken up to that fact and are starting to think, right, what are we going to do? We actually need now to grapple with these deep structural divides, and we also need to support these agents who are there, these structures that are there, that are holding things for us. So I think, I mean, we can continue. There's a lot of very interesting ways in which also the attention that is now being brought to these networks of care and solidarity, and ways of proposing to do cities differently, have already been practiced. And in a way, the whole array of possibilities, of solutions, of proposal that can be developed through platforms, now that the line is on that. And I'm very happy to develop some of these examples. But maybe it's good to stop here for now and have some questions. Caroline?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you for taking us from the sort of the overall big global scale to really making it land in neighborhoods and in people's lives. And I have a couple of questions, but I just want to say to the audience, please share your questions as well. Put them in the chat, and then we can look at them and discuss further. But one thing I'm always very fascinated by is this sort of this sort of, how shall I say, these contradicting forces between the state-led planning and then the cry of local organizations to engage, and whereby I often see that it's almost like the state thinks if we engage, it's going to take too long. And it's going to be slow, and we need to act now. We have these emergencies now. We have to make changes now and plans now. But even if that is the idea behind not sort of fully engaging with local organizations, you still see that things go far too slow. And we keep sort of in the same, working in the same pace. And I'm thinking, for example, about the movie, the National Planning Agenda for the Netherlands, fairly new, where I also see that the ideas that are in there, I don't think they will really lead to quick action and needed action. So again, there you have all these big frameworks. This is another one, doesn't really lead to rapid action. What is your experience in that? Because you have worked with these community groups, and is there a possibility to have rapid action through these collectives?
Sure. I mean, you raise a really important question, which is about temporality in planning. So planning raises so many different challenges. Is around these trade-offs that we're talking about. It's around temporality of change. And you're right that this accusation that participation or engagement with, let's say, with citizens takes time, because actually there's usually not that reflection around engagement with the private sector. or with in particular big private sector, big companies, right? There isn't that question. There's a sense that things might happen very fast, which it can happen very fast, but we also know that engagement with the private sector can be very slow, as there are some very many examples of white elephants in cities that show that actually it's not a given, right?
Yeah.
Another story that often comes up is, yes, but if we're going to be engaging with communities, we're not going to be reaching scale. So it's about temporality, but it's also around scale. And that's a really interesting point. But from my point of view, it's about a misconception of partnership and community engagement. It tends to be seen as a project level, and there is very few forms of or examples of engagement with communities that is at a citywide scale, where precisely that transformative change could take place in a faster way and at scale. And I think maybe it would be useful to bring a couple of experiences there where things have been happening fast and at scale. And so, for instance, examples of participatory budgeting experiences, which where you have, especially those that are, I mean, there's a lot of different examples of participatory budgeting across the world, and some are more or less progressive. So in fact, it's not, PB is a tool. So the question is how you use it. It's not of necessity that with PB, you're going to have something very transformative. But some of the more interesting examples of participatory budgeting, in my view, are the ones that precisely try to connect the neighborhood to also issues of citywide development. So that's about doing neighborhood change, but also engaging with issues, for instance, of mobility. So I'm trying to think, there's a city in Spain, and I don't want to, I think it might be Seville, but I may be making a mistake. So where the issues of one of the things that was voted in the participatory budgeting process was about developing bicycle lanes, and especially bicycle lanes that would, I can't find my word in English now, that would find a link between especially more precarious neighborhoods to the center of the city. So this is a really transformative process that has had a huge impact on people's ability to get livelihoods, but also to enjoy the city. Yeah. So not just find work, but actually to enjoy the city, not to be, and what's interesting about PB is that PB is always very fast in a way, because you have a budget line, and it's cycles of 2 years generally, right? The first year you discuss, and then the second year you implement, but it's super fast tempo, and things can be done very quickly. And so there's been a really interesting examples, and actually some very interesting studies in, I think it's in Belo Horizonte in Brazil, that shows how participatory budgeting, with quite a small amount of budget from the city and not imported budget from donors or from whatever, or from foreign direct investment, have actually contributed to start what they call inverting priorities, inverting spatial priorities of where budget is going, where investment is going. And showing that it's going, instead of being generally, as most sort of local government funding tends to be about, budgets, sort of rolling budgets, right? So there's very little which is actual real capital expenditure budget. And so what that tends to do is that it perpetuates the status quo, a certain unequal status quo. And PB, of course, on smaller budgets, but does tend to activate that spatial distributional dimension very quickly. And also what it showed in Belo Horizonte, because they had a number of processes where there was a dialogue between the local authority and organized community groups there. around the mechanisms of the PB, the processes of the PB, this has contributed to what they called also a political inversion of priorities. So those who normally were excluded from decision-making processes were now included. So this is an example of quick, rapid, and can be at scale responses. There's another example maybe that you, Caroline, know very well, and that I think you will have a guest on this session who's going to talk more about it. So maybe I will be quite quick, but just to introduce the notion of the Ban Man Kong program in Thailand, which is a quite unique program of government-funded informal settlement upgrading that is done at scale, because the idea is not little, a little neighborhood here and there. In many, first of all, it's national program, and also in many cities, it's lots of different programs, and then meeting together through the development of what they call city development funds. But what is particularly interesting there about this program is, a distributional change, a scaling up relatively quickly, so maybe not quite as quickly as if it was done with property developers, but with much more satisfaction with the end result, and therefore sustainability of the end result, if you want. So there again, you have a question of trade-off if you're thinking of temporality. But what's particularly interesting in the Ban Man Kong program is that, and it's quite unique, I don't know of many others that do it also quite like that, is that it's not through a top-down process. So whilst it's national government funding, it is a pot of money that is given to cooperatives who then develop their own response. So what that does, in a way, you could say, it's a kind of inversion of priorities that I've talked about in the participatory budgeting process. But it's it's a step change, because not only are you responding to an immediate material need in terms of housing and let's say infrastructure in informal settlement, you're also facilitating the building up of capacity of people, not only people in their localities, in these neighborhoods, but also the capacity of local governments, of maybe property owners, of various strands of government agency that have land, who are entering in negotiations with those communities. So you're developing not only a capacity, a distributional response, you're developing a capacity to develop urban development and urban planning differently, which can then be taken, at scale in different ways. So it's a different notion of what scale temporality means. And of course, I would argue much more structurally generative and more transformatory.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. I have two questions in the chat, one by Jonathan and one by Ganesh, but maybe Jonathan, we go to Ganesh questions first because it's related to the participatory budgeting. Do you want to ask the question?
Sure. Can just read it out from chat. No, I was just wondering if, thank you for the presentation, Barbara. I'll just start with that. That was a super nice overview of what's happening on in this big framework space. Now, I was wondering, while participatory budgeting aims to democratize financial processes, is there like examples of democratization of like technical know-how to facilitate scaling up of decentralized initiatives? I mean, in most places, we can't really have like government officials or like planners who are trained in very specific areas. So is there any examples of scaling up of this technical know-how democratization?
So I think it's interesting because both cases of PB that I've mentioned and the latest example from the Ban Man Kong in Thailand are in a way if I've understood your question correctly, so Ganesh, my apologies if I haven't, and then you'll have to redirect me. I think what they both do is that the idea there is that it's not just community groups who are learning to do things differently, or community groups, or basically neighborhood residents, right? But it's also local, it's also practitioners in the state that are learning to do things differently. And that is often the biggest challenge, actually, because there's a sense of, you know, we are the experts we know. There's also, with new public management, there's also all these forms of KPIs, you know, key performance indicators. That means that they have to do it in a certain way, et cetera, et cetera. But what is really interesting, and again, it's not all PB processes that do that, and certainly not all informal settlement upgrading processes that do that. But the example that I've chosen here are those where there is a conscious attention to involve local government official in that process of knowing and of learning. And it often means unlearning and relearning. Mm-hmm. So in the case of PB, I'm terrible with names, which is really bad, but and I could find that, and I can share it with Caroline, and who will share it with you. But what's interesting there is that there's been some examples where some of the experiments in participatory budgeting have partnered themselves, for instance, with the Paulo Freire Institute in Brazil, precisely to challenge the kind of know-how, technical know-how of people in local authorities, and to get them to sort of think through what does it mean to really co-produce. Others also have worked on so I mean, I think this one, the one where they teamed with the Paulo Freire, is somewhere in Brazil, and I cannot remember which case have done that. But also the ones where they're working on a guide of participatory budgeting. So they have a guide which every year is renewed and is meant to be renewed. So it's not just that you're renewing what you're voting on, what particular material outcome, but you're also rediscussing the rules of engagement. And that is the most extraordinary school of learning of, you know, how to do things differently. So this is it. And I guess the Bangmangkong case does the same, although of course, like, you know, like, as I say, not all PBs are as progressive. And with the Bangmangkong program, which was facilitated by an agency in the state, Kodi, there's also been moments where actually people fall back into easy ways of doing, which is when you have a local government planners in the state says what you need to do. And so one of the really interesting challenge for Kodi, as understood with this, because it was set up with this deep structural transformation objective, one of the challenges of the institution now is to, how does it not fall into this, we know how to do it, let's just continue doing it like that. But how do we really constantly ensure that there is this dance between the local communities or the neighborhood community and local authorities, which then scales up to other actors in the city. And that requires reactivating regularly.
It may be interesting also to note, and actually within the ACHR Kodi Bangmangkong framework, they have this network of community builders that are sharing really technical know-how. And that is a collaboration between experts, planners, architects, and community members.
Could you put that in the chat or something? I'm not able to get the name correctly.
Yeah, okay, I will put it in the chat.
There's an interesting article on that, maybe, Caroline, which you can share. I mean, this is with the community architects, etc. But on precisely this, trying to ensure that Kodi retains its transformatory role or facilitating role. And there's an article in Environment and Urbanization with Bunyabansha and Care, like from last year. Yeah.
I can share that article.
Thank you. Those were fascinating.
Okay, thank you, Ganesh. And then I think we have still time, Jonathan, for your questions. So please go ahead. You can pose a question.
Yeah, just one moment. Hey, Barbara, thank you for the amazing presentation. I also had a question which you may have kind of answered informally throughout your presentation, but you mentioned in the case of these communities or groups or even societies that have found degrees of success in mitigating or adapting risks, such as like to COVID-19, or whether it's maybe disaster related with direct action. What is the role of, I mean, planning and planners? I mean, as we become educated to see our role within the traditional state frameworks, what is the role of planning and planners within this type of kind of framework? Especially, I would like to add this condition where the state is, let's say, authoritative, chauvinistic, or even racist, to say, where certain communities are explicitly left out of the process and kind of general frameworks.
So, yeah, it's an interesting question. If the state is generally if the state is basically, the planner in the state is bought by certain interests in society and is not interested, therefore, in the publicness of planning, well, you as a future planner might want to question where you could locate yourself in the state, or alternatively go out of the state, I think. I mean, in the state, it's always important to think that the state is not homogeneous and that there are, you know, they will be, not everywhere, but almost everywhere, there are pockets in the state which are more progressive than others. And it might not be directly in the planning department. It might be, sometimes it is through, for instance, social welfare, or sort of more kind of where there's you might find that there's an indirect route to work in a more, in a way that sort of tries to address the needs, but also recognize the agencies of people who are invisibilized otherwise. So that's one way of looking at it. But I think, of course, a lot of the current thinking about planning is around extending the notion of who plans and who is the planner, and whether the planner is also precisely those communities, organized communities, or it can be community architects, or it can be NGOs, or it can be, or even in academia, there's a role of facilitating of, and it becomes really, I think, what it requires is a thorough sort of political diagnosis, I would say, almost political institutional diagnosis of who's there, where are the potential entry points, the cracks in the system, where are potential alliance that can be done. And so a role of a planner could be to be building alliances, for instance. So not directly working on the ground in you know, trying to address the situation of risk, but trying to facilitate processes of alliance building. So what this kind of planning, which is a planning that is more political, I guess, it requires a more flexibility in, I think, your definition of what the planner and who the planner is and what their role is. I would say, for instance.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, thank you very much, Barbara, for this last statement. I think it's important for all of us, this question of who plans and who is the planner. And I would like to link it to something you said before, and I really like it. It's like you said, we should be doing cities differently. And I think that's a nice sort of call to rethink how we are dealing with planning, and especially if you want to take this sort of ethical stance and think of a sort of integrated future, then doing cities differently will become a very important action, I think. So I would like to end here and thank you very much for your contribution and pointing us to this important different way of daring to do it differently as well. So, thank you very much, Barbara, and thank you all very much for attending. And I hope to see you at our next session. So please, you can look at the website, and there will be some more coming up in the near future. So thank you very much, Barbara. And
thank you so much, Caroline, for the invitation, and thank you everybody for the great question also, and for your time.